This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
It's great to see everybody here on a Friday night. Of course, I'd like to thank Gail Day and Steve Edwards for inviting me here to talk about Verrocchi's Das Silber und das Kreuz, The Silver and the Cross from 2010. It is a continuation of a conversation that we had at the Historical Materialism Conference last autumn, and it's a conversation I hope to continue because I think it's one of Verrocchi's most important films, but for a number of reasons really not very well known in the UK. So I'm really going to talk about it in terms of three aspects. First of all, in terms of Nicole Brenez's notion of visual study, and then A.L. Wiseman's notion of the forensic, which we can understand as a kind of radicalization of, on one hand, Patrick Keeler's notion of the fixed 12-second image, which you'll know from films like London and Lost in Space, and also, in a sense, a radicalization of Strabon-Willay's stratigraphic image. And then, thirdly, I'll reference Thomas Elsasser's notion of black leader, the kind of the black non-image that we see in Verrocchi's film Respite from 2007, so made a bit before The Silver and the Cross. But first, for those of you who undoubtedly have some context for this film, but it helps to set these kind of formal, aesthetic and political methods and principles into a context. I'll begin by saying that The Silver and the Cross can be characterized as a comparative visual investigation of the painting Description of Cerro Rico and the Imperial City of Potosí, Descripción del Cerro Rico e Imperio Villa de Potosí, which was painted over 2 years by the Spanish artist Gaspar Miguel de Berrio in 1758. A comparison of this painting with the city of Potosí itself in Bolivia in 2010, 400 meters above sea level, and then a comparison of an open-air museum which is kind of next to the rich hill, the Silver Hill. So it's a film in which 3 sets of events and 3 sets of locations are brought together.
It's going to be recorded for posterity on a podcast.
I'm so sorry.
So we have 3 sets of scenes. We have the Rich Hill in 2010, the Open Air Museum in 2010, and then this painting from 1785, which is filmed in 2010 in Bolivia, in the city of Sucre. And this was commissioned by the curators, the artists Alicia Kreischer, Andreas Siegmann, and the curator Max Jorge Hinderer for this exhibition. This is the catalogue of the exhibition, called The Potosi Principle, How Can We Sing the Song of the Lord in an Alien Land? Subtitled Colonial Image Production in the Global Economy. An exhibition that went to 3 cities, Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia in Madrid, Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, Museo Nacional de Arte and Museo Nacional de Etnografía y Folklore at La Paz in Bolivia. And Manuel J. Borja Villel, the director of Reina Sofia, writes the following. He says, in the 17th century, barely 100 years after its discovery and conquest by the Spanish, Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, but was then a so-called viceroyalty of Peru, was one of the most important cities in the planet, with a population larger than London or Paris. The silver and the other metals that were mined from the rich mountain, Cerro Rico or Rich Hill, as it was known, circulated the planet and were used to fund the Habsburg Wars in Europe and to repay the dynasty's enormous loans to German and Genoese bankers. The exploitation of the Potosi mines produced the first accumulation of capital in the modern period and was the forerunner of the model for present-day financial globalization. In Potosi, this excess of wealth was founded on the Mita, M-I-T-A, the slave-based system in which the indigenous population was worked in subhuman conditions. The Mita, M-I-T-A, was a system of coercive labor practiced within the Peruvian viceroyalty, according to the historian Peter Bakewell in his book Miners of the Red Mountain. So Bakewell goes on to say the Mita was not based on the arbitrary brutality of Il Conquista, the conquistadors, but was the means by which a modern state supplied its entrepreneurs with the population required to create added value. The population required to create added value. There was no immutable distinction between forced labor and free labor. The continuous shift between wage labor and free labor in Potosi reveals a system in which work has become a commodity and survival depends on money. And then Silvia Federici, in Caliban and the Witch, states that primitive accumulation is the term that Marx uses to characterize the historical process of capitalist relations. Its importance lies, above all, in the fact that primitive accumulation is treated by Marx as a foundational process, revealing the structural conditions for the existence of capitalist society. This enables us to read the past as something which survives into the present. So it's this last point of Federici's, to read the past as something which survives into the present, which is clearly carried over in Farocchi's methodology. We can say that the purpose, the imperative, the method, the force of the silver and cross is for Farocchi to take on this analysis of what survives into the present using a small number of constrained means. In his essay for the catalogue, the essay, it's a short kind of analysis of the process of making the film. Farocchi admits that he never embarked on a project before with so little prior knowledge. A project which demanded so much research and whose research was so difficult for him to undertake, such that it wasn't until he journeyed to Bolivia itself that the research was really able to take form in the shape of the actual work that we see. So what Farocchi points out then is a key aspect. When he was based in Berlin, he found the existing reproductions of the painting, of the description of Cerro Rico, to be inadequate. They were mostly black and white prints found in a New York exhibition catalogue, and there were a number of publications, and there was one colour poster. Farocchi says this is a crucial point. He says the original painting, measuring some 350 by 200 centimetres, so 3.5 metres by 2 metres, featured a number of important details, such as figures under a centimetre in size, representing workers that in these reproductions remain unidentifiable. In other words, in reproduction, there is something like a threshold of detectability already operative in the painting of Berrio from 1758, not 1785, as I said earlier. So the threshold of detectability that Eyal Weizman will later on attribute to satellite imagery, to the ability of satellites to the ability of civilian satellites not to be able to detect people below a certain threshold of pixels. This principle, which exists in satellites, is already operative in the reproductions of the painting. And in a sense, Farocki goes to Sucre, he goes to the Museo Colonial Charcas, Universidad San Francisco Javier de Chuquisaca, excuse my pronunciation, in order to study and to make visible and to find evidence for himself of these figures under a centimetre in size. The workers that in these reproductions remain unidentifiable. This is what's crucial for Farocki, to travel there himself and to study workers that remain unidentifiable. So when Farocki and his colleagues, the cameraman Ingo Kratisch, who he worked with from the 70s onwards, the sound engineer, researcher and producer Matthias Reimann, travelled from Madrid, from Berlin to Madrid, from Madrid to Santa Cruz, from Santa Cruz to Sucre in Bolivia. They found the painting, and Farocki describes it as follows. The painting was poorly lit, but the accommodating museum director, Orietta Durandal, granted us permission to open the windows and climb on a chair to study the details. When we began filming the following day, the painting was placed into an antechamber where it was illuminated indirectly and evenly by daylight. The museum staff readily assisted us in discovering and interpreting some of the details. So, in the several days of which Farocki and his team of Kratisch and Reimann began filming, a vocabulary develops, a vocabulary that we can see clearly in the film. We can enumerate this vocabulary one by one. First of all, we can see the fixed shot, the fixed camera shot, which scrutinizes the details of the painting. Let's remember that the figures, many of the key figures, as we'll see later, the key distinction that Farocki realizes as soon as he starts to look at the film, the painting carefully, is the distinction between what he calls the non-workers and the workers. It is the non-workers that are over a centimetre, and the workers, the indigenous population, are still too small for his camera to see. As you'll see, there's certain points where his camera is still straining to see the actual indigenous population. In other words, Farocki uses his camera as a kind of magnifying, enlarging device in order to, first of all, render the distinction between so-called non-workers and so-called workers, and then secondly, to make the distinction between the indistinction between so-called free labourers and so-called forced labourers. So first we have a distinction, and then second, within that distinction, we have an indistinction. And it's only by travelling to Sucre that Farocki can begin to gauge that double level of distinction and indistinction through the fixed perspective. We could characterize the fixed perspective shot in terms of Patrick Keeler's notion, which he narrates in the beginning of London. If you remember, Patrick Keeler says the following: Robinson believed that if he looked at it hard enough, he can cause the surface of the city to reveal to him the molecular basis of his own sorrowful events, and in this way he hoped to see into the future. The molecular basis of his own sorrowful events. So the fixed camera in Patrick Keeler's 12 seconds, Farocki's fixed camera is much less, but the notion of revealing the molecular basis of sorrowful events is gestured at in the fixed camera. So next to that is, of course, the travelling shot, and Farocki uses this, as we can see, to reveal pathways, to reveal waterways, to reveal the processions of pack animals, to reveal waterworks, viaducts to reveal the distinction between the houses of the wealthy and the houses of the indigenous. In other words, to trace through the painting a notion of cartography, a notion of mapping, and the notion of the evidentiary. Between the fixed shot and the moving shot, what becomes available is the painting as the scene of a crime, the scene of genocide. Farocki says, or rather, Farocki's voice-over person, Cynthia Beata, who's a filmmaker in her own right and who plays the role that Alexandra Stewart played for Marker. Cynthia Beata points out that the notion of genocide, the fact of genocide, is the fundamental condition of the Rich Hill. It is the fundamental condition of Cerro Rico. But she says that nowhere is that genocide directly portrayed. Nowhere is the violence that the indigenous population undergo. Nowhere is that made visible. In fact, she says it's silenced. In other words, for all the panoramic, epic perspective of Berriot's painting, there is something like not just a visual silence, but a constitutive silence built into the perspective of the painting. And this constitutive silence is shared not just by Berriot, but can be generalized throughout philosophy, throughout European philosophy. So the pictorial silence, which is understood as a kind of visual transposition of a disappearing, this disappearing has an epistemic implication, which is generalized across philosophy. European philosophy is also, in this sense, an epistemic disappearing of this genocide, and in this sense also carries the traces of the crime of the genocide. So it's clear that Berriot's painting is not simply a witness to a crime. It is not simply a commemoration of a crime. It is a participant in its disappearing and in its elevation of the Rich Hill. It is a participant in a crime. And we could say that not only the still and fixed perspective and the moving perspective, but Farocki's use of the black leader, the digital black, acts as a kind of respite which registers the visual silencing, or we could reverse it and say the audible non-visibility of genocide. And in this sense, the way in which the black image plays out, the way in which it plays out in the film, is evoked and calls upon the earlier film Respite. So I'm just going to quote from Thomas Elsasser, who talks about Respite a bit earlier on. Thomas Elsasser says, Thomas Elsasser talks about the image as a respite from the... Hold on a second. Okay. Farocki's splicing of Black Leader, this is Thomas Elsasser. Farocki's splicing of Black Leader creates the necessary gaps, the spectator, the necessary gaps into which the spectator may insert their own memories, be they media images, film narratives, history books, or civic lessons. Farocki's gaps, in other words, engender a kind of forgetting that should neither be filled with more evidence or forensic investigation. And this is Elsasser talking about Respite in 2007, which is Farocki's visual study of images taken in the Westerbork camp, in which victims of the Nazis were placed while they were waiting to be transported by train to concentration camps. And so these images in Westerbork function something like a promotional campaign for Westerbork camp itself. So there, Elsasser is saying that no forensic investigation is needed. But in this film, twice, Cynthia Beata says the role of Berrier's painting, the necessity of Berrier's painting has hardly been investigated. In other words, the future task of filmmakers to come is to carry out a new kind of forensics based upon visual methods of study. So the three methods we've looked at so far are the very simple ones of the fixed shot, the moving shot, and the black leader. And we can see at least three more. Obviously, we can see the close-up, the medium shot, and the long shot. And then we can see the movement in time from 1758 in 2010 and 2010 in 2010. And then most important of all is Farocchi's notion of succession and simultaneity. So by simply placing two images together, by creating something like a comparative method, or what Farocchi would call a construction method, Farocchi is able to enumerate processes of successive succession and successive simultaneity, simultaneous succession and simultaneous simultaneity. So he's able to read 1 and 2, 2 and 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2. In other words, he's able to permutate the relation between the closed shot and the travelling shot, between the fixed shot and the moving shot, between the close-up, the mid-shot, and the long shot, between the black abstract non-image and the image. And he's able to move and create a permutation between these three, between all these kinds of images, which create not just a visual study, but which open out to something like a rethinking of Farocchi's notion of visual study, which he inherits from Godard, which he inherits specifically from Numéro 2 in 1976. And in this film, the notion of visual study, the notion of comparative visual methods, starts to move towards the notion of forensic investigation. So you'll remember in the very end of the film, Cynthia Beata makes this point. She says that not only is it necessary to use the larger images of figures to understand the smaller images of figures. In other words, not only is it necessary to use visible characters to understand characters who are not distinguished, but she says that archaeology has already begun to work out methods for distinguishing the food that people ate in centuries gone by. Archaeology can now investigate the food that was digested in the stomach and the guts of people from centuries ago, and is thus able to distinguish whether these people had enough to eat or whether they starved. So here, Farocchi is gesturing towards a future forensic image which can move from the distinction between a pictorial hierarchy within the image, in which we go from a visible image of a non-worker to an indistinguishable image between the forced labourer and the free labourer, to a kind of magnification, to a kind of perspective which is able to, as it were, make visible the guts of the indigenous population subjected to a kind of social death, subjected to a life in death. Because let's remember, the key point of Cerro Rico, of the Rich Hill, is that the indigenous population are not subject to genocide. They are kept alive purely so that they can be worked to death. So there is a kind of life exposed to death that Frocki wishes to make visible through these simple registers. So, just to wrap up, I'm going to read from Eyal's notion of the threshold of detectability, which typically has been articulated in terms of satellite imagery, and in a sense show that Frocki's project is to take this project over and then use it to return to the past in order to show something like a new imperative project for visual imagery. So that something like a visual forensics, which this work enacts and performs, becomes a future project. So Wiseman says the threshold of detectability is the state of visibility at which an object teeters on the brink of being observable or not observable. This is an epistemologically enriched status in forensic terms. In it, the materiality of the thing represented, a building, for example, and the materiality of the thing representing that object, a film, a photo, a satellite, in this case, a painting. In such conditions, both the material state and the mechanical means whereby that condition is archived or witnessed both come simultaneously into view and under scrutiny. And this notion of both a material state and a mechanical means that come simultaneously into view and under scrutiny, this is what's at stake in those two final scenes of The Silver and the Cross. As you'll remember, there is a long shot in which we see the hills, we see the mountains behind the rich hills, and then we go to black. And then the next shot, we see black, and then we see the rich hills now. If you look at those in turn, you'll realize that Frocki actually matches them. The shot of the mountains behind the rich hill, which starts with black, and then the shot of Cerro Rico and Potosi now, they actually match, but Frocki separates them. And then the final shot is the matching. It's the matching of the hill from 1758 and then the hill in 2010. And in this matching of two times, the time of 1758 and the time of 2010, the time of painting and the time of video recording, in this comparative method, what Frocki seeks to do is to lay the grounds for a new kind of forensic imagery in which the material state and the mechanical means simultaneously come into view and under intense scrutiny. And Frocki's next project was to work with Eyal Wiseman precisely on this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone, and thanks especially Gail and the rest of the organizers of Marxism in Culture for inviting me. I will be a bit alien to the context. I think I'm coming from a different, as Gail already introduced you, I came from a different background, just by chance, not really by decision. But I will try to, so I'll try to do two things today, and I hope I will succeed. So the first thing I had in mind when watching the film, which I have only seen a trailer before today, was to become a sort of mythologist and try to find out why would someone try in our context today to go back to a painting of the 17th century and what's about the cross and the silver and where are we going. So my first reaction was wrong, and I thought it had to do with New York, the discussion on extractivism and the uses of what's now being called neo-extractivism. But then I found other phrases that I think were more indicative of what was going on, and then I could sort of I will do quickly the trace of what I think is the context of how these discussions around the cross and the silver and the role of mining and the conquest have been used in Latin America, but also in Europe. So, so the first one is a quick thing. That's National Rock from Argentina, and basically they say they came and they covered us. Game world with discovered us. They found that dancing gods, and they say, close your eyes, give me the land, and take the Bible. And then they say, time is money, and in this land you are a foreigner. So this is this idea that close your eyes, give me the land, and I give you the Bible has been repeated many, many times. It's repeated also somehow in the beginning of the film when they say we brought the cross and I took the silver. It's something similar. The original one, if you care, is from Desmond Tutu, but it's been repeated by Galeano in the open base of Latin America many times, and it's been used quite a lot. I have selections, but I'll go quickly. So basically, if you try to find out what's the idea behind this sort of equation of exchanging Christianity for land or for whatever was good about the pre-colonial period, you also find this other idea that's quite strong, and this about the decimation or the complete annihilation, I think it says in the film, of the original population of the Americas. So it says, Galeano says, for instance, the price of the tide of the terror and ferocity basically meant that after a few years, the population of 70 million was reduced to 3.5 million. So behind the idea of genocide, and there is like what I've been trying to capture in the title of what I wanted to speak about today is this triad of colonialism, capitalism, commercial capitalism maybe, and Christianity. And so the idea that behind the development of capitalism there is an important genocide that's sort of hidden. I think was quite helpful. Kodo was showing that in Farooqi's film, the idea that this is hidden from all the suffering is hidden from the painting is quite useful. So I could go on for a while trying to explain an idea that was in the first slide about the love strike. Basically, this is a myth that for a while there was an agreement between men and women and in Mexico to do a lover strike, basically to stop having kids for 2 years in order to not to bring new people to this this world that was becoming full of atrocities and so on. I could also try to go on speaking about like the way the quick spread of Christians in the Americas, the decimation of the Indian population, and how on the development of capitalism at the expense of simple robbery, as it's called in the film. But I won't do this because there will be two problems. One is I wouldn't be adding much to what's been already, I think, eloquent in the film. And the second one is because I think it's mostly wrong. So I will try to do my two things. The first one is to show, and I'll leave this, a more nuanced image of what was the conquest like. And the second one will be, I will not skip the challenge of what this myth speak about and try to discuss in our context what this really means. Because otherwise I would have been kind of embedded by the atmosphere of this sort of fascist building and end up like in spreading the religion of positivism. So I would not become just a bunker of myths, but rather I'll try to deal with them politically, I think, if I can. But, so bear with me. What's mostly wrong about the myth behind this discourse? I think it's the myth of passivity. And the way the colonization has been shaped is really wrong in this specific sense, where Christianity comes as a sort of gift in exchange of a simple robbery. And so one will be a closer look at the historical record. That's what we historians love to do. But let's go. But there is some interest in that, honestly. Let's have a look at Potosi. Potosi was, of course, the most important center of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. It brought 90% of the silver from the Americas, and it was discovered in 1545. So, behind this myth of discovery, which is mentioned as a myth in the film, and that's correct, there are many interesting things that speak also about the conquest and how it worked. So, the mines were, so the kind of the most simple myth of the conquest is that a small group of Spaniards came and conquered all the land in America, in the Americas, and this is of course that is lacking there all the complex politics of how they made local alliances with thousands of Inca warriors in the case of Peru, the many arrangements in which the existing social relations were reshaped into this new colonial situation, but had still lots to do with how and precisely who and where profits went and in which ways labor was exposed. So the history of Potosi is that it was well known even before Inca times, and was well known by Incas. And so basically they decided to let Spaniards know about the existence of the mine at a moment in time. It was 1545. When the Spaniards arrived, it was already inhabited, and there were 3,000 Indians living there, and using all these methods that basically, I will speak a bit about the furnaces that were used for the traditional method of smelting. So, of course, the arrival of these Spaniards made an important scale change, and in a few years, everything began to change rapidly. But we should not forget that they were not doing a simple robbery, as is said, but rather a complex alliance with certain groups, with certain local groups, and a complex building of labor and an exploitation using so far traditional means. So if we try to look at the complexities of the mining system, the first thing is it's not easy to describe what was really 3 centuries of a mining system. So basically it changed a lot during all those moments. The most important point of change is 1570s, when the Spaniards introduced a new method of smelting. Basically, they introduced the idea of doing amalgamation with mercury, and that they did for a technical reason, but also for a political one. So let me explain a bit about the mining system in the first place. It is true that the mining system depended on mita, on what's been called slave labor, but let's before quickly applying a category, let's try to think a bit about what was the mita like. First of all, the mita was around. It's estimated that the mita was around 10% of the labor used in mines. So it was important, but not just was not even dominant in this sense. The mita was forced labor, corvée in many senses, and it was introduced in the 1570s, and it was used till the 17th century. But the guy who was under mita was not a permanent slave; was rather under mita for a certain specific period of time, from 10 to 20 years. And he could, or she, well, he could, it was basically made, he could buy a replacement mitacho, so someone who will do the work for him. And so, according, of course, to the previous social stratification, you will find that certain people would end up doing the meet, and certain others would just end up appointing a representative Mitasha. There are all sorts of discussions in the 15th and the 16th century about, and discussions have been in which way is the mita to be covered, whether that's an amount of labor or whether that's an amount of products, and whether those products are raw products or they are cooked in one sense or the other. So mita is one of the many forms of labor, as I say, roughly 10%. You also have shanaconas, which are sort of indentured servants, and they are basically involved as artisans of silver. Silver was also being was in many cases being manufactured in Potosi itself. You also have large amounts of mingas, which were free laborers, and some who were mitashas, so who were mitas in other places of the country, but would go voluntarily to do labor in Potosi, and so as to pay the rent in silver that was quickly to gain than going back. I don't want to go into all the details, but what's important here is that you have a system that was really complex in the sense that the conquest was depending a bit on individual entrepreneurs. So you have the crown, and you have all many Spaniards where they are not representing the crown, but were trying to represent themselves. So they have rights to collect the rent. And this already began to be a negotiation. Christianity was, for many of those individual colonial entrepreneurs, was a cost that was added by the crown, so they had to basically sustain the charge against their own will. So what I'm trying to go quickly is that, let me go to other details. So ore was extracted from mine galleries, but then what you will find is that until the reforms until the introduction of amalgamation and mercury, the only way the Spaniards had to force and discuss how was ore distributed was basically by putting some control on the coca that was entering the city. So it was basically they didn't have any access to the traditional mills that were basically mostly administered by women. So and they would not be able to get as much metal as they wanted from the refining of ore, because they had no deal with that, and this was done in a traditional way. So changing the technical system was a way of breaking these traditional laws. But they had to give the Indians the legal right to what's called corpa, which was basically a share of the ore they produced. So even mitashas were slaves, say, or forced labor, will go into the mine and will keep a share of the ore they brought, so that they could then basically trade the silver in this case outside the colonial system, well, sorry, not also the colonial system, the Spaniards. This ore market was around 25% of silver by the 1850s, and the 80s, and still in the 80s, in the 1550s, they were still complaining about how 38% of silver was kept by the mitashas and others, who would also go on the weekends and at night to collect silver on their own. So what I'm saying is, what I wish to smash is, I'm not saying how good it was to be colonized. That's not really nice. As a friend pointed out in a discussion about slavery. What I'm saying is, what we should not assume is that colonization was simple robbery and was basically a matter of encountering the passivity of Indians. So what I'm trying to show quickly is that resistance was strictly, and though this kind of political negotiations was strictly the part of the core of colonialism, which is fair for all the subjects that were colonized, but it's also fair to our own understanding of what was going to come next. So I won't get into the details now whether this was winning commercial capitalism or not. I think we can discuss that later on. What I long wish to miss is to take the I think I have still 5 minutes.
Yep.
To take the challenge of what's this myth about, and why this speaks to us, like the te fabula narratur, the old idea that this fable speaks of you. So why can we present together passivity, Christianity, defeat and death? And what that has to do? And I'll try to think about the question of Christianity and capitalism. This is by Leon Ferrari, who is, it came immediately to my mind. I hope you will keep in yours for a while. I tried to think about why we have this strong myth of passivity and colonialism, and that ends with the exchange of close your eyes and take the Bible while I take your land. I first came to, and I will just try to briefly quote a few things from, while showing these pictures of Leon Ferrari. We'll quote a bit from Leon Rosigner, someone who basically tried to say that the Christian spirit and capital have complementary metaphysical premises, and we have not, from the left, criticized them enough. Actually, he also, in the last time, tried to show how even the left was saying that the saints are models of activism, and we should go back to. I won't get into those wrong path, so to say, to be Christian. But basically, he tried to show how the Christian technology has reorganized the human mind and has allowed for capitalism to be possible. Because he says, without an expropriation of human mind and body and subjectivity, it's not possible to have capitalism. So he speaks of the thing and the cross. And an interesting quote is from Capital, Volume 1, when Marx says, the religious world is but the reflex of the real world. And for a society based on the production of commodities, for such society where they reduce their individual private labor to the standard of homogeneous human labor, for such society, Christianity, with its cult of abstract man, is the most fitting form of religion. So I think there is a call there for us to take and to think about in the future, as Farooqi might like to say. So that we have to think about how triumphal capitalism has been possible by this symbolical reorganization of such activity in the new religion of the Roman Empire. And Rosigner tries to speak of grace and terror, and how you have you have within Christianity the two sides of what's really the same thing. Terror is inscribed in our bodies, and describes in our own subjectivity, and he says by the most important myth, which is Jesus, who was a sure rebel against the political power of the Romans, and who is now shown as someone who's been defeated and dead, and is repeatedly shown as someone who basically failed in that sense. So, and he says, in this way, the terror is being internalized, is certainly becoming part of our own minds and subjectivity. And so, in order to do any kind of resistance, we should confront the anxiety of death that terror is the cancer in oneself that's been inscribed in ourselves. So I think that the call of Rosichern to think about Christianity and capitalism and the many ways they have been intertwined, and how even though Christianity of course precedes capitalism, it has some strong connections with it. It's a way of reconstructing the affective dimensions of politics. And it made me think that it's actually, in the myth we saw today, and I tried to first debunk and then try to think about what it really means, it's actually us, the ones who took the Bible and lost the land, and not the Indians of Potosi. So I think the figure of resistance depends a bit on opposing our adult and real and collective resistance. That is to say, what we can call politics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.